Empty bus terminals all across North America cried out in terror and bewilderment yesterday upon hearing the news that CNN has fired its top-rated primetime personality and number one weightlifting correspondent, Chris Cuomo, better known as Fredo, and presumably the actual viewers who watch CNN for non-ironic purposes, all 18 to 20 of them, were just as upset as the empty bus terminals that form the cornerstone of their audience. Now, first things first, and ladies and gentlemen, you know how much it pains me when I make a correct prediction and then have to talk about how right I was, but I told you this guy was doomed. The day after his brother, the governor of New York, whom I also told you was doomed, by the way, 2 months before his actual resignation, became the disgraced ex-governor of New York. Because let's face it, the only reason that Fredo Cuomo ever had a job talking on television was because he was the mildly retarded younger brother of one of the country's most prominent politicians. It sure as hell wasn't because of his skill at talking about world events, since the level of expert analysis you get from Fredo Cuomo is commensurate with what you would get from any random homeless man. But admittedly, the homeless man probably can't curl 60 pounds one-handed like Fredo can. And I can't help wondering, does it add insult to injury when you get fired from the only workplace in America where you can jack off in front of your coworkers during a work meeting and still keep your job? Now, to me, possibly the funniest part of this story is CNN pretending to have any concern for journalistic ethics. Sure, it was fine when you were using your primetime national news program to do lame comedy skits with your brother, the governor, and sure, it was fine when you were lying about your fake COVID quarantine so casually and so brazenly that even CNN viewers found it unconvincing. And sure, it was fine when you asserted that calling an Italian guy Fredo is exactly the same as calling a black guy the N-word. And sure, it was fine when you were asking impossibly moronic questions on the air like, where does it say that protest is supposed to be peaceful? And to answer that one for you, Fredo, it's in the very first sentence of the Bill of Rights where it says that, you idiotic meathead. Here at CNN, we can tolerate all of that, no problem, but using our resources to dig up dirt on your brother's accusers, this is a bridge too far, my good man. We simply cannot abide such an assault on our rigorous ethical standards. So it's fun that Jeff Zucker has laid such complete waste to the credibility of CNN's brand that even when they're pretending to value the precepts of journalism, it's still impossible to take them seriously. Like everything else CNN does, it just makes you want to laugh. And yeah, technically, I guess they didn't fire him, but even though CNN is calling it an indefinite suspension, if we ever see Chris Cuomo's face again on CNN's air, I pledge to legally change my first name to Fredo. So it turns out that back a couple months ago when CNN suspended him for a week or 10 days or whatever it was, due to the fact that he had been helping his brother, the future disgraced, boob-groping, grandma-murdering ex-governor, run the PR campaign whereby he was hoping to avoid having to resign or be removed from office, he seemingly wasn't very chastened by that experience, for it seems he went right back to doing the same crap they had suspended him for in the first place. And since Fredo Cuomo lives by the motto of go big or go home, he took the additional step of using CNN's employees and CNN's resources to try and slander the women who were accusing Andrew Cuomo of serial sexual misconduct. Because if there is anything in this world that's totally unconscionable, it's the idea that CNN would ever sanction, much less consciously engage in, a personal smear campaign against an innocent, blameless private citizen. And Nick Sandman can tell you all about that, provided he is not busy counting the $60 million that CNN had to pay him for waging a concerted, weeks-long, all-out assault on his name and his character and his reputation. And yeah, obviously it does fall under the heading of damning with faint praise to call Fredo CNN's top-rated host, since their ratings have gone so far down the toilet bowl of irrelevance that top-rated CNN host is about as auspicious an honor as being the skinniest girl at fat camp, or, if you prefer, the lone survivor of an Alec Baldwin gun rampage, which, speaking of that leads nicely into the topic of tonight's main segment. So Jim Eagle, hurry the hell up and hit the damn music. From atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we always thought Omnicron was the name of a strain of high-grade marijuana. Omnicron, get it? Alright, maybe that one was funnier in my head. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And a strange thing happened to me this morning. I clicked on an article from Variety, and instead of being met with a bunch of woke-tarded, shill-tastic Hollywood bullcrap like we normally expect from Variety, I found that it was actually a pretty good piece of investigative journalism that was written without any discernible political agenda and which shed a fair amount of light on the events surrounding the incident wherein Alec Baldwin fatally shot cinematographer Helena Hutchins and wounded director Joel Souza. The reporter's name is Gene Maddaus? I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but it's Maddaus. I do highly recommend reading the piece, and I will provide a link in the description if I don't forget. And yes, it is extremely sad that it's such a rare and noteworthy event now when we see good, competent news reporting coming from anyone in the mainstream media. But on those rare occasions when it does happen, I think we should give credit where credit is due. But before we get into the contents of the Variety piece, we need to talk about the fact that Alec Baldwin, for reasons that no sane person could possibly fathom, sat down for an interview a couple days ago with George Stephanopoulos, which will be airing on ABC tomorrow night. But the audio track of the interview, that's already publicly available, and I had the chance to listen to it today. And Mr. Baldwin, I can't help asking, what in the actual hell were you thinking when you agreed to do this? Granted, doing a George Stephanopoulos interview is standard procedure when you're a woke leftist public figure who is in the midst of a PR crisis and needs to rehabilitate his image by doing a softball interview with a fake journalist. But, dude, do you not realize that you're still very much subject to being criminally charged here? So how do you think it's going to look from the perspective of the Albuquerque District Attorney, who is literally the only man in the world whose opinion you should be caring about right now, when he sees you on television claiming with a straight face that you never pointed the gun at anyone and never pulled the trigger? And yeah, he actually said that. And look, not to split hairs or anything, but there is a certain 42-year-old woman lying in her grave right now who, if she was alive, would probably take fairly serious issue with the claim that you never aimed or fired that weapon. So hypothetically, Mr. Baldwin, if the DA had been leaning toward not charging you, do you think this interview and that particular claim is going to help your cause? Because it seems far more likely to this observer that the effect is going to be quite the opposite. Now, if Mr. Baldwin is claiming that the gun discharged accidentally while not being aimed by him at anyone, it does not help his case one little bit that the weapon he was wielding was the 1873 Colt Single-Action Army, a vintage revolver, and an accidental discharge of a vintage revolver is just about impossible unless you drop it while it's loaded and configured in a certain way and it hits the ground just exactly right. But it's still an incredible long shot, no pun intended. In real-world usage, the normal practice with that type of revolver is to load it with 5 rounds, leaving one chamber empty with the hammer resting on the empty chamber. If you had a round loaded in all 6 chambers, then you would have the hammer on half-cock, so the firing pin isn't resting on a live round and an accidental discharge is less likely should you happen to drop the weapon. But if you're holding it in your hand and you haven't moved the hammer to full cock, an accidental discharge is effectively impossible, which brings us along to the most important unanswered question of them all, which I still haven't even heard anyone ask, and unfortunately there was nothing in the Variety piece that brought us any closer to an answer. Namely, since all they were supposed to be doing was blocking the scene and getting the camera angles, why was this revolver loaded with anything? Live rounds, dummy rounds, blanks, I don't care. Doesn't matter. Why would anybody use a loaded firearm to rehearse and block a scene? For the purposes of blocking a scene, you don't even need the gun at all. You can point your finger and make pew-pew noises at the camera, and they can still get their angles. The Variety article makes no mention of this, but it does provide a chronology and a series of events that gives us the best explanation we've had so far for how live rounds could have wound up getting commingled with blanks and dummy rounds, though it still requires a hell of a lot of incompetence and inattention by multiple people on the crew in order for a live round or rounds to wind up getting loaded into a prop gun. According to the Variety article, the confusion may have originated with a guy named Thel Reed, who is a longtime Hollywood armorer and the father of Hannah Gutierrez Reed, who of course was serving as the armorer on the Rust picture. The guy who rented out the guns they were using on the production is a guy named Seth Kenney. According to a statement given to the investigators by Thel Reed, he and Kenney had worked together back in August or September of this year, giving firearms training to actors who were about to shoot a different picture. It was Reed who brought the ammunition to the range that they used for the training, which was a bunch of 45 rounds in a coffee can, some live, some blanks, some dummies. So they finished the training session, and Kenney winds up taking the ammo home with him. And although Reed tries several times to get it back from him, he never does. And it looks pretty clearly like those rounds in that coffee can were the ones that wound up on the set of Rust. But here's where it gets interesting. The live rounds that are in the coffee can, they were reloaded rounds, which is a term they use when you take an empty shell casing and make a new round out of it by inserting your own powder and your own projectile. But the shell casings that were used, presumably by Thel Reed, for making the reloaded rounds, they contained, on the butt end of the casing, the trademark of a company called Starline Brass. Starline Brass makes blank rounds, and they make dummy rounds, and they sell components for making live ammo, casings, powder, projectiles, etc., but they don't manufacture completed live rounds. So if you're someone in the industry and you're checking the cylinder on a loaded prop gun and you see nothing but rounds with the Starline Brass logo on the bottom of them, and you're in a hurry or just not paying sufficient attention, it's not difficult to see how someone might notice that trademark stamp on the bottom of these rounds and think, oh, there's the Starline Brass logo. That means these have to be blanks or dummies, so no further checking is required. We're good to go. Of course, if you actually pulled the rounds out of the chambers, it would be clear even to an untrained observer that, this is a blank, this one's a dummy, this one's a live round with an actual lead projectile in it. And this is especially true with the blanks, because a blank contains no projectile, and a blank cartridge bears not even a superficial resemblance to a live round. With a live round, it's apparent with even just the most cursory glance that, yes, there is a lead projectile protruding from this casing, so this is a live round. A blank round, since it contains a powder charge but no projectile, what is normally the open end of the casing is deformed and folded in on itself such that there's a distinctive X marking on the end of it, in addition to the fact that the finished product is much shorter and shaped differently than a standard live round containing a projectile would be. In other words, a person would have to be blinder than Ray freaking Charles to be able to look at a live round and a blank round of the same caliber and not easily discern which one is which. It can be a little bit trickier with a dummy round, because a dummy round does contain a projectile, but it's a non-lethal projectile. Now, in the weeks since this incident happened, we've heard lots of people, including people who should know better, using the terms blank and dummy interchangeably, but they aren't interchangeable terms. They mean different things. A blank has no projectile in it. A dummy round does. In the days before CGI, the use of dummy rounds used to be pretty commonplace, much more so than it is now. The most common application was to tip the round with a fake blood packet shaped, in the same shape as the live round would be, so that when you get shot with it, it just stings a little bit, like getting hit with a paintball, more or less. And you get a nice splatter of red paint on your chest, and it looks for all the viewing audience like you really got shot. But even still, it takes only a cursory examination by a person who's paying attention to tell the difference between the one and the other. So if this is your trade, your profession, if this is the thing you do for a living, there is no conceivable excuse for live ammunition being loaded into a prop gun. First and foremost, because there's no excuse for live ammo being anywhere near a movie set. But when we get a few of the blanks filled in, no pun intended, When we hear the entire story about the shooting range and the coffee can and the reloaded rounds and the trademark, when you add all that information to the facts we already knew, specifically the fact that the armorer on the set was a 24-year-old girl who considered herself unqualified for the job she had, and the fact that crew members had been spending some of their downtime shooting live ammo at beer cans with the same weapons that were being used on set, the pieces of the puzzle start fitting together quite a bit better than they did before. But we are still left with no answer for why this weapon had been loaded with any rounds of any kind, when they were just rehearsing and blocking camera angles and were still presumably hours away from rolling camera and shooting the actual scene. They were not rolling the cameras at the time, which tells us they were still in the very early preliminary stages of composing the scene. But in any event, I made the prediction 2 days after this shooting that I felt like, number one, Alec Baldwin's movie career is over. Number two, he's likely to have criminal charges laid against him. And number three, it's not out of the question that he winds up doing time in the pokey. And I still think all of those things. If this thing had happened in California, then maybe he could expect to be insulated from prosecution. Maybe he could use his industry and political connections to skate and get off scot-free, but it didn't happen in California. It happened in New Mexico, which is not exactly a hotbed of wokesterism, where the authorities are unlikely to give a dude a free ride just because he's a famous actor and Democrat Party mega donor in good standing. And I continue to think that when somebody inevitably makes a movie about this incident, the plot of that movie, fading actor making self-financed Western picture on a shoestring budget with underqualified crew members in key positions, accidentally liquidates his own cinematographer, will be much better than the plot of the picture they were actually trying to make. As for the Stephanopoulos interview, I remain totally at a loss to understand what he thinks he has to gain by telling such bald-faced lies on national TV while the investigation is still ongoing. If there was ever a time in life to remain silent and stay the hell out of the public eye, this would have been that time. A Stephanopoulos interview is not going to resurrect your career, Mr. Baldwin. It's too late for that. Is this guy actually so divorced from reality that he thinks he can make this thing go away by doing one softball interview in which he makes a series of claims that are so fantastically, verifiably false they could make Joe Biden blush? Because it seems like he might actually think that. And yeah, we all know the Hollywood elite types tend to live in a state of perpetual disconnect from objective reality, but to look into the camera with a straight face and claim you never pointed the gun and never pulled the trigger, that is an altogether new and more breathtaking level of self-delusion. If this maniac really believes the claims that he's making in this interview, who knows? He probably believes his wife's name is really Hilaria and she's really from Spain. In any event, once this ABC interview airs, and once this Variety article makes the rounds, I feel like I won't really know what to think until I hear some good hard-hitting analysis from the giants of American journalism. But with Fredo Cuomo now on the sidelines, who is going to tell me what I'm supposed to believe? So thank God we have still at least got Brian Stelter and Don Lemon to help us parse reality from delusion. Because we little bumpkin rubes need all the sophisticated intellectual guidance that we can get. And that is it for tonight. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I will see you Friday, by which time there should be plenty of delicious fallout from this monumentally ill-advised Stephanopoulos interview. And if you're drinking tonight, do be sure and pour one out for our good buddy Fredo, or I guess maybe it would be more appropriate to do a few 12-ounce curls in his honor, since he is, after all, America's greatest weightlifter. But at any rate, here's hoping he lands on his feet, and preferably not in the bottom of the river while wearing concrete shoes. So until next time, have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.